critiche concrete sulle attività. Grazie.
Yeah, I think that's it.
So, well, I'm going to talk today a little bit about the research I'm doing as a PhD. I'm also an architect, and I'm interested to understand certain practices, architectural practices, that are very much connected with the right to housing movement, and also with the idea of self-management in the office, but also in the building site. So these are practices that try to develop new ways of seeing architecture, not only based on the drawing, but also based on the knowledge of the building site. So it's also interesting to understand it as a concept for this idea of what is social architecture, something that maybe you are all interested. And the idea of social architecture is not only about the object itself, that you are doing something because somebody needs, but it begins on yourself and the way you relate to the other, on your relationships. And the relationships it starts by denying that architecture or the architect is an authority. Everybody is an authority. Also the worker is an authority, the builder is an authority. Also the client is an authority. So this idea of an horizontal relationship between all the people who take part on the process is one of the things that I'm going to talk about. That's why we call the self-management as one of the main principles that are adopted by Usina and then also by other architects. This is Sérgio Ferro. I'm bringing him because he's not so famous, but his work is quite interesting. He's Brazilian. In Brazil, he starts to be talked about. Maybe you know.
Yes.
So, why he's so criticized by the architects community? Because he starts to say, you architects, you are responsible for architecture being so elitist because you base all of your architecture in your drawings. And the drawing can be a tool of oppression too. And actually, we architects, also myself, we fall in love sometimes with the drawing process. And this drawing process sometimes is too graphic and doesn't lead to a good construction. So what he says is that it's very important to make that architects are more and more in the building sites, that their drawings are drawings for the construction and not something that is only to be seen on an exhibition. So this is a little bit of biography. He taught also in the architecture school of São Paulo. Then he publishes some texts. One of them is became very notorious. Is the chantier, the building site and the drawing, where he tries to problematize this idea of the relationship between the drawing process and the building methods. And then in France, he's going to live the rest of his life. He tries to develop this further with the School of Grenoble. So this is a short introduction. These are some of his first houses. He started to work as a collective with the other two architects, Rodrigo Lefebvre and Flávio Império. And his main concern was to democratize the architecture. As we said, in São Paulo at that time, most architects were designing houses for rich people, and many poor people had to do their houses on their own methods, self-built houses. Like that's how the favelas actually were formed. So he was concerned about why don't we use our knowledge for everybody. So one of his first projects was these vault houses, where he tries to make these construction methods more and more easy for everybody to build. I have some doubts about these catenary vaults. They are not so easy to do, but it was based on his first experiences. Unfortunately, he only worked as an architect until his 30s, because then he had to leave to France because of the dictatorship, military dictatorship. But then he starts to devote himself to writing, and he writes a lot based on his reading of Karl Marx. And he says, but he's very critical to the Communist Party. He says, you must read Karl Marx in a different way, and we have to see architecture as a process, economical process as well. So he says architecture is also a commodity. When we are building houses, we are building commodities for people to buy, and we are also responsible on creating a brand. So if we don't understand this, we can never be social as architects. So always in this perspective of being creating a better society where everybody has the right to have a house. So he starts to denounce the building site. This is an image of Brasilia being built, the beautiful project of Oscar Niemeyer. But look at the people, how they are working. They have no safety conditions. No? They are working in conditions under the sun without any kind of nobility as well. So these are people coming from the poor areas of Brazil, and they were almost like slaves working in there. And Sérgio Ferro asks this question: how is it possible for architects like Niemeyer, who belong to the Communist Party, they don't care about this situation of the building site? He cares a lot about the drawing, he cares a lot about the ideals, but then the building site people, in order to get his drawings built, people have to be in these circumstances. So what Sérgio Ferro is trying to say is it's very important that the architect doesn't stop the process of architecture on the drawing. He must go further. He must design he must understand who is going to build it and how is it going to be built. And this is part of the process, and it's something I think that you are also experiencing here. Now that you are having your hands dirty, you know how things are being built, and when you are going to design something, you know why you are designing like this. But our experience as architects, especially in this time, is very much based on drawing. And this is what in schools are taught. So this is a part of the critique. And exactly the drawing. So this is the building of Brunelleschi and the dome of Florence. And it's when construction starts to be led by architects. Because before that it was the cathedral workers who were the main leaders of the construction process. So through the drawing, which is something abstract, architects gain an authority. And this authority was very important to put down all the masons, the cathedral builders. And what he says is that more and more during the teaching of architecture, this process of drawing becomes more and more abstract and transforms itself in some kind of alienation for the builder. The builder sees these drawings and sometimes he doesn't understand, or sometimes these buildings are too abstract, have nothing to do with the materiality and the nature of the building process. And this is one of the first critiques to the drawing. And this is something we can see still today in the websites, in the exhibitions. Some architectures that are being presented are only based on the drawings, but when they are built, first to be built is sometimes very difficult. Imagine the Bilbao Museum in Spain, for example, from Gary. And then when they are used, is it worth all this effort? Well, maybe, maybe not. So that is something our architects have to think about. And all this critique of the building site process and the collective worker. So Sérgio Ferro claims it's important that there is a collective worker. that architects work together with the clients, the future dwellers, first in the process of defining what is going to be their houses, and then also with the builders and with all the institutions. This he calls the collective work. Everybody is important, it's a team, and it's not the masterpiece of one person. So Usina is one of the collectives of architects that work in this way. They are from São Paulo. They are one of the many technical assessments, that's the name they gave to architects that work together to give consultancy and to coordinate the architecture and building process of movements of right to housing movements. So in São Paulo, mainly in São Paulo, during the 90s, there were some programs by the PT that promoted the building of collective housing, not by the states, but by the groups themselves. So the groups organized as dwellers organization, a little bit like the cooperatives that we have in Europe, could choose how the housing would be and then build it themselves. It's what they call the mutirão. Mutirão is a group of people working together for the same cause, in this case, for the housing. So this is only an example. This is the canteen. People are working together, professional workers and the future dwellers working together, and they establish also a social communion in this process. They know how to build, they start to take care of each other, and it's a process of self-help that is very important, not only for the result of the house, but also as an empowerment of your own relationships. This process is developed a lot by Usina and other technical assessments, and is, in my idea, a way of or a model to establish non-profit housing projects. During this whole process, there is also thinking about how is it going to be built. Because if you are building partially with amateurs and partially with professionals, you have to think about, are you going to use brick? Are you going to use concrete? Or for example, in this case, the staircases were built before in steel, and they were built first because they could be organized as some kind of scaffold to transport all the material, and also to organize the different levels. So Usina, as an office, also works in a self-management way. So it's not a normal office with the CEO and the partners and stuff like this. There are people who are older who founded the Usina, but they still earn the same as the younger who come inside. They don't earn so much, but they believe that it should be all equal in terms of salary. And they all discuss all the projects together. They work with the builders from the first phase on. It's not at the end that they are going to talk with the builders and engineers. So the idea of self-management is also applied here in their office. Well, some of what I'm talking is also in this text. But this idea of self-management is also a tool, something that they bring then to the building site, and with the work with the different dwellers. They spend lots of time having different meetings with these people who are very poor, who work on the weekends to get their houses, and who have to fight a lot, although the state gives them some money, but it's not so easy process. Some give up, others, but those who continue at the end, they have their own house. The house normally much bigger, 3 times bigger than the houses given by the state. And we are talking about a country where there is almost no social housing. So this is very important that this process is happening with the initiative from the people. Yes, another thing is that this it's a system that promotes self-respect, self-organization, and therefore autonomy. The fact that it's autonomous from the state gives them a lot of freedom, And for example, Usina is working exclusively for these movements. It's an office that only works with these projects, always researching in technology, in materials, and for example, this case of this Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is also an important person connected to these movements. I know then when I do the interviews and I talk with some people from Usina, they wanted this to be blue, I guess, or some other color. But the people who are going to live there wanted green, so it's green. So it's important, just a small example of how important it is, this discussion, even in these small details, with the future, the people who are going to live there. Just before, another thing that is very important with the process of Usina, it's not only architects part of the team, also social workers. So sociologists and people who are also very good in organizing these participatory processes. And another thing is that 80% of the Mutirantes are women. So it's a real case of women power here. Also because many of them are mothers and they really feel this need to get their house. Sometimes the husbands, they are not so...
Mutirantes?
Mutirantes is the name I give for it's a Brazilian expression. Comes from mutirão, and it's people who belong to this collective working group. And the people that are, okay, this is not organized spontaneously. There are organized movements like UMM, União Movimento Moradia, or Movimento Sem Teto, Moradores Sem Teto, or even this all began with the movement of workers, farmers, which is Sem Terra, Movimento Sem Terra. But Sem Terra is on the land, and these movements are on the city. Well, this is a very specific context. Now I'm talking about the second case study. This is in Barcelona. Okay, this is completely different economical situation. The need for housing is different. There is a need for housing, but not so tragic as in São Paulo. Here people are being kicked out from their houses in Barcelona because of gentrification and because of tourism. And this new government of Ada Colau is promoting the cooperatives. So in this case, in the case of Brazil, people from the movements, they keep their houses, but the law doesn't allow them to have a collective property. In this case of Barcelona, there is a long tradition of collective property. Collective property is a cooperative, when all share the same space. And in this case is the example of LACOL. LACOL is also a group of young architects. They are also organized as a cooperative and also self-managed. And this is an example of one of their first projects, La Borda. It's mainly for young, well, it's not for very poor people because they need to have some money to get a loan. But even though they all work inside the cooperative system, cooperative banking, and the city of Barcelona lends them the plot for 30 or 50 years.
Which part of Barcelona?
This is in Sants. And well, this is an example that we can see. It's also important, the common areas. So this is a little bit like co-housing, we would say. But this was designed together with all the future dwellers. So for them it was important to have on the top, on the roof terrace, a small winter garden. And it's also a system that allows the circulation of cold and hot air. So there's a system of ventilation. And it's also important the collective spaces for the guests and for parties or what they decide to do. And this is an example in Barcelona too. This is another another group. It's called Dynamo. Dynamo works with Lacol actually, and it's a group that tries to catalyze the process of cooperative housing, to find people, to get them together, to get them to know each other, and to build a group from scratch, build a house project from the scratch. So this is a small diagram of all the process until they finally get their houses. What's the big thing about this kind of housing? It's that you build yourself, you think of them yourself, you're not dependent on the market, you're not dependent on what they offer you. You can choose how to design your own house together with other people and to discuss this together with other people. And then the price is always cheaper if you don't have the margin, profit margin of the promoters. So you are promoting yourself. So this is part of the research I'm doing, trying to understand how to apply these processes here in Portugal. My research is very based on the methodologies of communication between each other, how to work together better, and how to build together better in these situations. There are other examples in Europe, not so many, but I think it's a movement that's starting and it's important to be aware of. And that's it. I leave this. So I don't know if you have questions before.
So I had a question of the first practice you talked about, Usina. They're quite a small firm. Is that right? Maybe between like 10 to 15 people overall, or is that right?
Yes, it depends. It's changing. Depends on.
I was kind
It's not a firm. It's like a non-profit organization.
Okay. I was kind of curious about if you knew of any examples that could make that on a larger scale. So maybe a larger collective or a larger architecture firm that kind of has those values, but they've also managed to work on projects that are the larger scale, larger impact.
Well, this group Usina, they are maybe 10, 15, but they were working on project collective housing for 200 apartments. They have one with 700 apartments, so they work on a big scale. They started doing small spaces, like small housing blocks, but now they are working in a bigger scale. The problem is that the government changed recently, and the support is not so well. It's a big if. We don't know.
How is the permission to build the building? The permissions?
The permissions here.
Yeah, that to ask to build the social building.
The permission.
Yeah, the
Which-
my permission to ask them when you're gonna do a house for a social or what group or community.
This is a program that the government launched. In this case, last case, Minha Casa Minha Vida Entidade.
Oh,
And then you have to ask, you have to buy before, you have to buy the land. So that's important that the social movement has some money before. And then you find people who belong to this movement. After a while, they can get chosen, or I don't know how it is, the selection, to start their own project. And they start to fight for to get some funding. And then once they work with the architects, and once their application is confirmed,
yeah.
they can start to get the funding and to work for the project to be built. It's not so easy, and it takes a long time, many years. But yes, it's what they have.
Yes.
See?
So you're telling that you're studying this to apply in Portugal. Is there anything happening here, or do you see that is some kind of framework that is possible to do this in Portugal?
I think there is a framework to be applied. We can use the opportunity of cooperative housing that is in the Constitution, and in the new legislation about housing there is mentioned that there's going to be some support for cooperatives. But there are different kinds of cooperatives. That there are cooperatives only to promote, and that just hire an architect and he does what he wants. The idea here is to work with the people from the from the scratch, and in this kind of collective worker system. This is, I think, it's a matter of starting and trying to.
You already have an example of that in South.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, so it was a program that existed for 2 years in Portugal between 74 and 76, and in a time where there was, Portugal had a dictatorship for 50 years almost, 48 years. Then there was a military coup, and they took power of with a left-wing government. And in this time, people went out to the streets reclaiming lots of things, and one of them was housing. There was this big need for housing. There was actually not like today in Portugal, the situation was much worse, where architects would work together with the communities. The communities were organized as well as organization, and they were designing together their houses. This was between 2 years. Even though there were more or less 200 projects built, it was not bad.
I think it's a big difference between rental or ownership.
Exactly.
Yes.
Because we are also, I'm part of an initiative in Ljubljana, in Slovenia. We are just starting to develop the model, and we are fighting for the rental, non-profit rental cooperative, with no way for the apartments to be bought off.
Exactly.
So that's the fight, and I think it's a big difference between one or the other, because the cooperative is the organization which owns the apartments, and the member is only the renter. So you're, at the same time, it's a funny position of the renter, because it gives you, in a way, a right as an owner, because you are part of cooperative, so you basically are owning part of the cooperative's property, which is the building. But we really want to go for long-term, the rental, non-profit rental cooperative, because we believe, Slovenia is a specific housing situation. We don't have rental apartments. We only have 92% of ownership with privately owned apartments, and we're really missing this part. It's really hard access to apartments, of course, for young people especially, because they can't buy it. And now it's a big fight for introducing this model. And it's a difference between ownership or rental apartments. So, yeah.
Yes. In the case of these collectives of Barcelona, it's a temporary ownership.
Yeah.
You cannot leave it for your children or something, but during your lifetime you can, but you are always paying some kind of rent, because of the loan that you get together.
All right. Thank you very much.